Even though our offices still remain closed, we are excited to be able to continue to share our programming online. Tonight's program is part of our series called Bearing Witness Stories of the Holocaust. In 1985, as part of the Birmingham Jewish Community's Memory Bank project, some Holocaust survivors and other Jewish community members were interviewed as part of a community archival project. Well, as you can imagine, for the survivors, an oral history is difficult under normal circumstances. But add to that the difficulty of an individual with a traumatic history, the desire to tell it all, and the passage of time. And for some of these histories, we have 50 to 60 type pages of disjointed memories that make it for a very difficult read. If you're interested in that full read, you can find that on the BHEC website. But in order to make this archival treasure approachable for students and the public, the BHEC has long wanted to turn these personal ramblings into a coherent, teachable story, a task that needed a skilled writer and a storyteller with an eye for details. In addition, we had other histories from the USC Shoah Foundation and even personal memoirs to work from. We wanted to create an abbreviated story for our website and then a much fuller story with all of the facts for our archives. Then along came a gift in the form of COVID-19 and Minna Goldberg. Now, Minna is a graduate of the Alabama School of Fine Arts, where she studied creative writing for 6 years. She's bilingual and a dual citizen of France and the United States. Her mother is French, her father is American. And when COVID hit, she decided to postpone her acceptance at the University of Michigan for a year. And she was looking for a meaningful work experience. And so a match was made. For the past year, Minna has worked tirelessly fulfilling our dream. This fall, however, she will continue on her personal journey at Michigan, where she plans on studying environmental science. Minna's work reflects the very essence of our work at the BHEC, to remember the Holocaust survivors who lived in our midst and to learn from their experiences so that we can create a better future. I personally want to thank Minna for making all of this possible. And for you, our supporters, we thank you for your continued support. During the program tonight, everyone will remain muted, but we do welcome your questions both during and after the presentation via the chat box that's located at the bottom of your screen. Please remember that whatever you type in that chat box will be sent by default to the whole group. And after our lecture, we'll have a period for questions, and I will take your questions from that chat box and direct it towards Minna. We appreciate your cooperation. And so without further ado, please welcome Minna Goldberg.
Hi, everyone. Thank you guys so much for joining us tonight. It's really exciting to me to be able to share this with you guys. All year, my family has been pelted by these stories, so now I finally get an audience, and I'm very grateful for that. And I'm also incredibly grateful for the BHEC. It should go without saying that none of this would be possible without them. They work tirelessly at maintaining documents and testimonies of Holocaust survivors and making sure that those facts and those stories are never forgotten. And they do a great job of that. Everything that I've been sent is really well organized. And yeah, it's just very well preserved. I'm going to tell you guys basically just a little bit about what exactly it is I do and what my process is, and pretty much covered it all. But like she said, I basically start by looking at the materials I'm sent. So it could be a testimony, a Shoah testimony. There's also been many survivors who have had memory bank memoirs written for them. The memory bank memoirs were created by a community project in Birmingham in an attempt to interview survivors and other members of the Jewish community to keep their stories and have everything in one place. So yeah, I mostly use, like I said, these testimonies or memoirs, but I also use supplemental information like photographs, family trees, other documents, pretty much anything that has any value in writing the testimony. There are times where it can be challenging to find all the correct information. Like Anne's mentioned, it can be extremely difficult for survivors, especially after so long, to give like a fully comprehensive account of everything they went through. So it can be challenging, but the BHEC also does a really good job of reaching out to family members in an attempt to try to gather any missing information. There were often times where I also had the opportunity to contact those people and make sure that I had everything right. Another thing that I think was really good was that the BHEC makes sure that after I write the bios, they're sent to the family so that they can look over it and make sure everything's right, make sure that it lives up to their family member before they allow it to get published on the BHEC website. So yeah, if any of you are interested in looking at these bios, there's a shortened version on the website of BHEC under Alabama Holocaust Survivors. But yeah, like I said, pretty much the main technical obstacle is missing information, incorrect information. But in terms of just an emotional standpoint, it can also be pretty difficult, I found, to read these stories at times. Because they're just devastating. There's not really any words for what these people have gone through, and it can definitely be daunting to try to approach their stories. There were definitely times where I felt worried about a bio I was writing not living up to that person or that it wouldn't do them justice. But I just had to remind myself that the important thing is that their stories are being preserved and shared. And I think that's really a great gift. So I'm going to go ahead and get started on talking about one of the survivors' stories I worked on. Her name is Dora Nesselroth. This picture is of her. It was taken by Birmingham News. It's her standing in front of a portrait of her younger self. So she was born in Poland. Her father was a great philanthropist. She was born into a really loving family. She has really warm memories of her childhood, like going bike riding with her parents through the woods, picking like berries and going to museums and reading. But sadly, as a lot of these survivors experienced, their childhood happiness did not last for long. So her father, like I mentioned before, was a philanthropist. He opened a theater in his town. He opened a library. He even opened a night school for unemployed people so that they would be able to find a job. And the town loved him. He was very well known for being a great person. But of course, none of that mattered to the Nazis, who came in 1938 and changed Dora's life as she knew it forever. So after Hitler invaded, soon after, she and her parents and siblings were sent to live in a ghetto for 2 years. Dora didn't really elaborate much on what it was like living in the ghettos, but based off of other counts, it was just a deplorable place to be, dehumanizing, and I mean, anybody living there would not really be able to relax or feel safe at any point. Just a very traumatic time in her life. So soon after, in 1942, she was sent to work in a munitions factory with 150 other young girls, not very safe for any of them. It was a very dangerous workplace. But I mean, after a while, it kind of became, I guess, a better option than to be in the ghettos. But she still had to walk 3 miles there and 3 miles back every day until eventually ghetto liquidation was threatened. And what ghetto liquidation basically meant, at least for that ghetto, was that Everybody inside of it would be sent to a concentration camp, probably a bunch of different ones, and most likely her family would have separated and been killed. So, being as fearless as she took it upon herself to approach her director of her camp and basically bribe him by telling him about all of the silver and gold they had at their house, and was trying to tell him that she needed her parents to be there. And he accepted. Her parents were sent with her to work in the camps, and they stripped everything that they had off their house. When they went back afterwards, there was nothing left. So after working at the factory, she was sent to a concentration camp called Chenstochau, where the conditions were absolutely deplorable. She and her mother were there. It was a factory where they had 1,500 people in one barrack. No matter what the weather was, if it was winter, it didn't matter. They were given the same paper-thin clothing. They had 12-hour-long work days where whenever they faltered or hesitated, they would be beat. They would even be beat just randomly on the whim of the officers. And people died of starvation every day. People died in chambers every day. Dora said that the only reason why she was still alive at the end of her experience there was because she just thought of her father, and how he was her guide through all of it, which I think is just really powerful, because it just goes to show how the conditions were so bad that really the only difference between life and death was something you had inside of you. Like, it was rare that people had the means or the motivation to go on, and when they did, that was all that made the difference. But in 1945, or at the end of 1944, she was liberated. However, liberation is not exactly as positive as it may seem, at least not in this case. In 1944, the Red Army went into the camp and transferred all of the prisoners. They were trying to transfer them elsewhere in a Russian-occupied area. So what they did was they put 120 people in one boxcar. They gave them only cheese to eat, nothing to drink, for days in the middle of winter. So as you can imagine, this did not end well. Of the 20,000 people that were still remaining from the camps, only 4,000 remained after the evacuation. So many people had died from being crushed, from being starved, from the cold, from the elements. Over half of the people passed away just in that few weeks time span. So as you can imagine, being in a boxcar filled with dead bodies is very traumatic, and Dora remembered this for the rest of her life, everything about it. And it was very difficult for her to talk about this. It was clear that the Russian army was not interested in saving the prisoners. It was more of a tactical move on their part. So it really wasn't about liberating the prisoners at all. However, in 1945, on January 15th, somebody knocked on her boxcar and told them to come out, and they ran to the nearest city. The Russians told them not to go because they thought that since it was Russian occupied, then the Jews would just be shot. But they had no choice. I mean, they couldn't just stay in the woods, so they went into the nearest city, and they somehow made it through, and they were able to live their lives in Poland after that. In 1945, the war ended. So after the horrors that she endured, she tried her best to, get back to life, even though it was difficult. She felt a great sense of responsibility towards her mother, towards other family members. She became a correspondent for a newspaper and traveled everywhere, but being in Europe still made her nervous. She didn't feel fully comfortable there. She mentions in her memoir several times that after the war, she made a promise to herself that she would never step foot in Germany again and that she would never speak a word of German ever again in her life. So she kept that promise, and she made it a promise to herself that she would leave Europe and come to the US. So she was pretty successful in Europe, but like I said, that didn't really mean as much to her as her peace of mind. So in 1947, she met and married her husband, Max. They moved in together, opened a factory, but they still wanted to leave. The Czech government, made it very difficult for them to have a business. They eventually closed it, but until then, it was kind of a nightmare for them to keep it open. So they finally received American visas in '62. By then, it had been a long time, or at least longer than she had expected. But by then, she had become a certified X-ray technician. So she worked in New York for 3 years until her husband was transferred to Birmingham. So her husband was a chemist, and he was moving around with his company, and she was just overjoyed to be leaving Europe and to be moving to New York. So at first, I mean, I think that this is a really common thing that I saw throughout reading these survivor stories, is that people who had experienced, like bigotry and racism in Europe, especially Jewish people during the war, they felt really scared to go to Alabama because Alabama, at least then, didn't exactly have the greatest reputation as far as acceptance and welcoming people in with open arms. And so a lot of the survivors I read about expressed that they were very nervous about coming to Alabama, and some even hated it after they got here. But Dora was actually pleasantly surprised. She was really worried at first. She thought she would face the same things that she faced in Europe. But it ended up being different for her, in her experience at least. She mentioned that she and neighbors would often have like philosophical conversations about religion. She and people she came across, if they asked her about Judaism, it was not in a disrespectful way. And she was very surprised by that. She enjoyed living in Birmingham for her last years, and made lots of friends, and so did her children. Her two children, she has Rosalie and Ruth. She also has many grandchildren that she got to meet before she passed. So yeah, that says 1988. It should say 1998. She passed away from natural causes, and she'll always be remembered by her family. She, like I said, she was absolutely fearless when it came to protecting her family. She would do anything. On many occasions, like, she stood up for herself, for her family, even in the camps, and just was incredibly fearless. And you can't even expect anybody to be so fearless, of course, in this situation, but she expected it from herself, and that's what she did. So yeah, Dora Nesselroth is, she was definitely one of the survivors that I felt very connected to, almost like I knew her, just because I admired her so much and her strength after everything she'd gone through. So here's some more pictures of her. That's her in the left. It's her with her two daughters, Rosalie and Ruth. And on the right, that's her and her husband, Max, on their wedding day. All right, so next I'm going to talk about Helena Montner. Helena Montner, actually, I had a bit of a different experience writing her bio, because I wrote it based off of a memoir that she actually wrote herself. It's about 200 pages long, and it was an incredible read. If you're interested, I highly recommend it. I think you can find it on Amazon. It's also in the BAGC archives. But either way, Hella Montner, she was an incredible woman, an incredible writer, and I'm excited to tell you guys about her. So let's get into it. Yeah, so she was actually born Helena Rubicek, but ended up going by, or Rubikova, ended up going by Hella. And she was raised by a very wealthy family in Prague, but unlike you might expect, the wealth was actually due to her mother, who was an haute couturière in Prague and who impressed the entire country with her skills. So in Hella's words, her father was a deadbeat and no good, and her mother got rid of him very early on in her life. So she has no real fondness for her father, and throughout her life, you'll see that she kind of feels the same way towards most men in her life. She had a lot of suitors and a lot of people trying to gain her hand in marriage, but she really just had an individualistic spirit and felt as though she needed no one, and she didn't. So at the beginning of her life, during her schooling, it was always clear that she was an incredibly bright student. She excelled in languages by far. She even mentions once that after going to school in Switzerland to learn French, she went back to Prague, learned English in a few months, and then went to England. So that's just what it was to her. Learning a language was just a snap. And by the time she was 20 years old, she knew Czech, German, French, and English fluently. But in addition to her being incredibly intelligent, she was also just the star of the show. She was like, the life of the party. When I was reading her memoir, I just had a big impression that she was the main character of her life by far. Starting at 14, actually, she started to draw in college-age suitors. The first man that she ever had a romantic endeavor with, his name was Willi, and he was actually a part of an anti-Semitic fraternity, which meant that he was charged a fee for going out with a Jewish girl. So you can see how that might be a little taboo for Hella's mother and Willi's fraternity in general, but that's the kind of person she was. I mean, people would have done anything to be around her, to be with her. So yeah, she remained with Willi for quite a bit of her childhood. He ended up passing away in battle during World War I, after which she mentions even being slightly relieved that she no longer had to stay with him. But at this time, she was attending school in Switzerland. Well, after attending school in Switzerland, like I mentioned, she moved on to England, and she was in England when the war broke out. So she was attending a regatta with her chaperone, and I think it was a certain figure didn't appear that day, and everybody was wondering where he was, and then 3 weeks later, the war had broken out. So she really saw it happen with her own eyes, and she wanted to stay in England, of course. She was having fun and she didn't want to leave, but her chaperone insisted that they go back and return, which was the smartest decision, and all three of the Rubikova children returned safely, which her mother was extremely relieved about. And like I mentioned before, Hella's mother was she wasn't just wealthy, she was just very smart with money. She built herself from the ground up. She wasn't born into any money. She didn't even have an elementary school education. She just built herself from the ground up. She knew how to invest. She knew what to buy. She knew what to predict. So even during the war, there was really no change in the quality of life for Hella. You know, she said the only thing that she remembers that changed was that there was less meat to eat. But other than that, her mother really provided for them. So by 1914, Hella's mom had gone from just being a dressmaker and making good money from making dresses to actually being an haute couturière, owning her own high fashion salon. After the war, actually, Prague became a hub for politicians, diplomats, celebrities. And so, you know, since Hella's mother was just as fluent in other languages as she was, diplomats loved the fact that they could speak to their dressmaker and have conversations with her. So she became incredibly popular and incredibly wealthy. She and Hella would go to Paris almost every weekend. And Hella described these years as some of the best of her life. She traveled everywhere. She met a lot of suitors. She lived lavishly. But of course, all good things have to come to an end, sadly. Hella was very disappointed by this. But once she reached her mid-20s, her mother decided it was time for her to move on, to get married. So she sent her to Vienna with her grandpa, her uncle, and her aunt, who had already picked out a suitor for her. And when she saw him, she almost cried. She was so disappointed. She talks about how unattractive he was, and she just refused to marry him. But her uncle mentioned that he owned a sanatorium, which I'll show you in this next slide. It looked like this. A sanatorium, I don't think it's really ever been a thing in the United States, but it's basically just a place for people who have like long-term illnesses to stay and be treated. So that is where she wanted to be. She just fell in love with the sanatorium, and she knew that's what she wanted. As she said in her own words, I knew I wanted the sanatorium. I just had to buy the man that came with it. So that's exactly what she did. So after some years of being content at the Himmelhof, Hitler was beginning to rise to power. But for her, the years that she did have at the Himmelhof were just incredible. She got to speak to so many different people. She described it as a kaleidoscope of people. Everybody loved to be around her. She loved to socialize and communicate with people. It was just the sole fact that she wasn't the biggest fan of her husband, physically or even personality-wise. She thought that he wasn't as competent as she was, which, as you'll see later, ended up to be true. But I mean, I don't think that's really fair, because I feel like anybody that she would have married would not have really met her expectations. She could do everything herself. So anyways, after 1938, Hitler took Austria, and from that moment on, Hella would never feel safe again there. She really did not know, you know, how to react to the situation. She felt on the one hand that they should go because she was scared, but on the other hand, you know, there was the Himmelhof. They had built their whole lives there. And at the time, nobody in Vienna really believed that Hitler was actually a threat. They thought, you know, even if he's elected or comes into power, they didn't really believe the things he was saying. Unfortunately, they were wrong to believe that, but Hella was very distraught. She was torn between the two. And to make matters worse, her husband was extremely optimistic about the situation, even after, like, even in 1939, when their Jewish friends were just disappearing every day. They couldn't do things, they couldn't go out to eat, they couldn't go to the theater, they couldn't do any of the things that Hella loved so much about Vienna. And, you know, constantly, the Gestapo would come to the Himmelhof and ask for their money. And every time, her husband had to tell him that the owner wasn't there, which they got away with for a while. But that was really when Hella's mind started to change, and she knew that they had to leave. So her younger brother, Robbie, she had two younger siblings, Ada and Robbie. But Robbie sent American visas for them as he was already in Birmingham, and they were able to cross the border with forged passports, which was very stressful for all of them because the passports looked nothing like them. She said that her picture, it was a pale blonde woman, and her husband the same, a pale blonde man. They just looked nothing like them. And so waiting in line at the Czech border was like the longest few minutes of her life. And the Czech border police obviously knew it wasn't them. But at the time, the Czech government wasn't completely overtaken by Nazis, so they let them through anyways. So Hella created quite a life for herself in Birmingham. Moving away was stressful, but they safely made it to the States. They joined her brother Robbie in Birmingham. They had to stay in his apartment, his very small apartment, for many days until she finally got fed up, and she managed to get the money to buy this building here, which is the Highland Terrace Gardens. I'm not sure if the building is still up today, but it is in the Highlands area. So she basically started using it as a way to rent out rooms, to make money. She would cook, and I think about 3 meals a day even she would cook for her guests. And people would just go there to hang out and spend time. More and more it became a place to go to eat and to dance and to listen to music, and not so much just for, hostel purposes. It was the life of the party, and people went there to see her too. Even in her later ages, she brags about how she had people, men flirting with her, younger men, even when she was in her 80s. She was quite the gal, and she really was just full of life from start to finish. So yeah, I think that it was really incredible reading about her terrace room because her mother did the same thing. I mean, her mother worked her way from the ground up. She had an idea, she had a passion, and she started with her business. And she made it through and made it successful, and I think that is just highly impressive on both of them. And I think what's even more impressive is the fact that it's possible for a parent to instill such an attitude in their child, and that even though that person might face adversity in their life and might face huge struggle, they're the same person that they were. And especially Hella had so much strength to be able to create this empire basically after everything she had gone through. After the war ended, she tried to get in contact with her mother and her sister. Even throughout the war, she would constantly send letters, but she could never get a hold of them. And it was devastating for her. I mean, her mother was, one of the closest people she had in her life. And actually 60 plus people in her family passed away in the war. Many of whom she was extremely close with and that she knew. And unfortunately, that was also a common theme I found in these survivor stories, is that the survivors were one of the only survivors in that family, in that bloodline, which is just devastating. And it just goes to show how the chances of, somebody surviving, it's really based on pure luck and chance. So leaving that note, this is a picture of Hella with her 2 children. This is Willie and Nellie. She had a son when she was younger, before she had Willie, but he sadly passed away at 2 years old from leukemia. But Willie is actually named after the German soldier Willi. He always had a place in her heart. But yeah, she was just an incredible woman. I mean, she built herself from the ground up, without her mother, even without anyone. And I don't think I mentioned, but her husband during this time, he had been investing in a company in New York, or so he said. And she later found out that he had lost everything. So if she hadn't created her own business, if she hadn't been took it upon herself to be the breadwinner, who really knows what would have happened to her and her family. And I mean, nobody had to tell her anything. She did it all. And the fact that she was able to do it after losing so much, I think really, really says something about her. But yeah, I mean, her memoir that she wrote was absolutely incredible. I think that when I finished the book, I was actually really sad to be leaving her. And I don't know if this sounds silly, but I felt like I really knew her, and I just felt very connected to her. And I think that it's a worthwhile read. She was just an incredible woman. So yeah, I don't have any more survivor stories in particular, but I also wanted to talk a little bit about, why I think it's important to preserve these stories and to read them and to remember them. And I think one of the reasons is because a lot of us, well, I mean, if you think about Holocaust survivors, you probably think about like the more gruesome imagery attached to it. You probably think about the concentration camps, the horrible conditions these people were put through, which of course is, it did happen. And that is one of the main takeaways. But I think it's really important for these people to have something other than that. They deserve to be remembered for more than just their trauma. They deserve for people to remember them as a whole person, as someone full of life, and someone who's not just a victim, but somebody who got over and built themselves up after experiencing something so traumatic. So I think that it was really, I feel as though it was very productive to be reading about these people's lives outside of the Holocaust, because those stories are just as important. And I also think that, when I came into this, I kind of thought that I knew what to expect, and I didn't think that it would be too emotional for me, but I was definitely wrong. I think that you can't really understand just how much this sort of thing affects the person unless you read their whole individual story, because it really gives you an entirely new perspective on not just the war, but on their experience of the war, and how a lot of Jewish people felt about the world and others after all of these things happened. So yeah, and I think that, just for the more obvious reasons, something we say about the Holocaust a lot is, never forget. It's extremely important, that, because if there's not a sort of being held accountable, and not even like any of us are personally responsible, of course not, but I think that everybody should always hold themselves accountable for making sure that something like this doesn't happen again. You know, the reason why this happened was because people just stood by and watched. And I think that reading these stories, like while they can be extremely gruesome and difficult to read, um, I think that that's sort of the point, because then you'll never forget. And it's also important to know what kind of things to look out for, you know, in terms of patterns of fascism or um, anything on a smaller scale. It's just very, I think it's a crucial thing to remember this, to keep it in the back of our minds, and to get to know these people because they deserve at least that. Um, I guess, well, that was basically a little bit about my experience and my thoughts on everything. But as far as like my experience goes with this and what I think I took from it, it's really been an immeasurable experience. Um, I I mean, it's been really one of the most, or if not the most worthwhile experience I've had. And even though, like I previously mentioned, it could be really daunting to approach these stories, and not just daunting, but also at times really emotional. Just to like, you know, hear about this, and not just what happened in the concentration camps, but it can be very upsetting to read about just the horrible things that people said about Jewish people. But I think that that's kind of the point, is like to make yourself feel uncomfortable. And I definitely felt uncomfortable at times, but I feel like I came out better for it. I feel like I understand much more than I did before. And I also feel like I met a lot of people this year just through reading these stories. I feel like um, I was able to meet so many incredible people, to get to know them, and that is just really priceless. You know, every time that I would finish reading somebody's story, I would think about them later and wonder about them, and you know, they still pop into my mind, even ones that I wrote a year ago. Um, they're just, they're almost yeah, they're a part of my heart now, and I really do think that um, at least reading these stories, and you all for, you know, hearing about them, is just a really great step for everyone. Um, but yeah, I mean, I'm just overall very, I think the word to describe how I feel about my opportunity with the BHEC would be honored. I just feel very honored that I was able to write these people's biographies, and that their families trusted me with their stories and their testimonies. And I'm just incredibly grateful for the BHEC for, um, you know, being with me through all of it, helping me through, and for giving me this chance to really do something very worthwhile. Um, yeah, that's the end of my presentation. I think it's time for questions if anybody has them. Or
Thank you so much, Minna. I mean, that was just beautiful. And the way you encapsulated these stories and embraced them and really got to know particularly these two very strong personalities. Thank you so much.
thank you.
So everyone, if you do have questions for Minna, please put that in the chat box and I will be happy to direct those questions to her. I guess I have one question for you, Minna. I know you particularly related to these two women. Is it because they were very strong personalities and that's something that you you could look up to, or what was it that these two particular women stood out?
Yeah, it's definitely because I could look up to them. You know, I don't know if I mean, I definitely wouldn't put myself in the category as being so strong as they are, but I think that's the reason why I was really they in particular really caught my eye, because I think they're just people to look up to. And even I think that it says a lot that even during this time, they were still strong-willed and independent. And yeah, I think that everybody could look up to that.
And I think what was so powerful too is that you no longer saw them as just victims. You saw them as the individuals that they are, and that was a really powerful experience, I'm sure.
It was, yeah, that was definitely one of the best things about it, was being able to learn about them as a whole.
Does anybody have any questions? Your chat box is at the bottom of the screen. You can just click on it and type in your questions. Okay, so Sarah has asked, how can you find what camp your family was sent to and any particular websites you would suggest? So you can go on to the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum's website. They do have a search vehicle through their archives where they search all of the Bad Arolsen archives, which are the records of the Nazi regime, and you can submit a search that way. If you can't find that yourself, please feel free to contact me at the BHEC, and I will send you a link to that search opportunity to find out about camps that your family members would have possibly been in. Esther Levy has commented, thank you for doing this. She is well acquainted with Dora Nesselroth's story, so she's glad that you studied her too. Yes, Esther was one of the first to do a presentation on Dora.
I actually looked at that. I used that presentation while making my biography. So thank you for the presentation. She was really incredible.
And Marietta Goldberg, she'd like to know who shared the stories with you since they had already passed.
Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead and answer that.
Well, I don't know if I can give as much of an in-depth answer as you, but a lot of the testimonies, like, they were recorded before these people passed, and they've been in different archives, different places, and it's just a matter of like gathering the materials that after these people have passed. But I think we received them from many different places.
And Catherine asks, what experiences or schooling or training in your background helped you prepare to write these wonderful biographies?
So I, like Anne mentioned before, I actually studied creative writing, but I will say that writing in this way is much different. But I think something that did prepare me was reading a lot about, well, at least a lot of my teachers had me read different things about traumatic historical events. So I think I was well enough acquainted with writing about different tragedies for me to like be able to really get the right tone and, not do too much of this or too much of that. I think it was just about having those readings that helped me find the balance.
Kathy writes, she's concerned and surprised at how little young people as a group seem to know about the Holocaust. Do you find that to be true? And if so, do you have any thoughts on what could be done to change that?
Yeah, I totally agree with you. I think that it's kind of scary how little young people know about it. I think that there was a period in which young people were learning about it a lot, but it seems to have dropped off in the recent years. As far as what can be done to change that, I think that really the best thing for young people to learn about things is in school. And I know that that seems like an obvious answer, but like, for example, at my school, there was an elective available to learn just about the Holocaust, which is completely different than breezing over it in history class, And I think also attending groups and like presentations like this, I think it's really educational. And I think that it would be good if, they were targeted more towards younger people as well.
So your Nana writes, how can we find your biography? So let me answer that. So Minna has submitted her biographies to us. Not all have made it to our website yet because, as she said, they have to be cleared with the families first. So as soon as they are cleared with the families, they will go up on our website, the short version. And then if you are interested in the longer version, you can contact our archivist and we can provide you with the longer version of those as well.
You can also contact me.
Yeah, she'll send them to you. Unapproved. Sure. Does anybody else have any questions? Well, thank you all so much for attending. A couple of notes before we leave each other. You will receive an email survey after this program, so we hope you'll take a few minutes to provide us with some feedback. We will also be posting a copy of this recording on our website within the next few days. You can see this on our website. And please mark your calendars for our next community program on Thursday, August the 5th, when we will hear from another 2 interns at the BHEC who have been scouring the archives at the Birmingham Public Library to read about the Holocaust in the Birmingham newspapers. So they are looking at the years between 1933 and 1945. Also, check out our online learning page on our website, which offers additional learning opportunities that are offered by Holocaust centers throughout the world. And then finally, I hope you'll be able to join us for our annual fundraising event. It's called L'chaim, which means to life. That will be on Sunday, August 22nd. And during that program, we will be honoring the founder of the BHEC, Phyllis Weinstein. So thank you all again. Be safe and have a good night.
Thank you all so much.
Thanks, Minna.
Thanks.